Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sandra Grego, and I am Project Officer and Communications Assistant at EUROPARC Federation. We are thrilled to have you with us today as we dive into our session focused on insights from the pan-European research project Life Prognoses, characteristics, ecosystem services, and protection of European old-growth beech forests. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping notes to help things run smoothly. This webinar is being recorded, so please feel free to adjust your video settings to whatever makes you most comfortable. Make sure your name and organization are clearly displayed. You can update this by clicking the three dots next to your profile name. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to drop your questions and comments into the chat. My lovely colleague Jessica will be monitoring them. If you have a question that is directed at a specific speaker, please mention their name so we avoid any possible confusion. Time permitting, we will also open the floor for live questions later on. Now, for those who might not yet be familiar with us, let me give you a quick introduction to EUROPARC Federation. EUROPARC is the largest network of protected areas in Europe, uniting around 400 members from 40 countries. Our vision is sustainable nature valued by people. Through collaborative projects, innovative programs, and events like this one, we are committed to fostering knowledge exchange and sharing best practices in nature conservation. From webinars and seminars to large-scale conferences and rich library of resources, you can find all of that on our website, europarc.org. Speaking of events, it would be a shame not to mention our upcoming EUROPARC conference, which is happening from 7th to 10th of October in Lithuania. We'd of course be thrilled to see you there, so please make sure to register. The link with more information will be shared with you in the chat. With that, I'll pass our virtual mic to the guests and speakers who will guide us through today's topic. Chris van der Kerkhove, Peter Meyer, Manuela Hirschmugel, Klaus Steinbauer, and Caroline Sellis. The floor is now yours.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm the first speaker of today, and I will shortly introduce to you the project Life Prognoses and some of the results related to the topic I will be talking about. I will first try to share my screen. My presentation will be focusing on the definition of primary and old growth forests and how to move from a definition to benchmark values specifically for beech forests in Europe. And this research was done in the framework of the Life Prognoses project. So I first will shortly introduce the Prognosis project, then something on definitions of primary and old growth forest, moving into some criteria and indicators, some results from the Prognosis data set, and then some conclusions and outlook. So first about the Life Prognosis project. It's a so-called life preparatory project, which means that it is not a typical life project, which is mostly focusing on nature restoration. These life preparatory projects are more scientifically oriented and try to provide information to EU about important issues on nature conservation policies. So it's about protection of old growth forests in Europe, focusing on beech forests. We have 14 or even 15 partners from 8 countries, and the project ran from January 2021 until the end of this month. The focus is about sites which are part of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, ancient and primeval beech forests of the Carpathians and other regions of Europe, which covers a wide variety of the best, most natural beech forests in Europe. And these are, of course, also our topics of research. As in most international projects, the tasks are subdivided in a number of work packages. Work package 1 focuses on the development of criteria and methods to assess and map old growth forests, and more specifically beech forests in Europe. So focusing on definitions of old growth and criteria and indicators, and also testing the potential of remote sensing technology to map potential old growth forests, which will be covered by Manuela later today. In a second work package, we try to assess the ecosystem service values or added value of primary and old growth forests compared to regularly managed forest on carbon storage, on structural diversity, on climatic impact, and the potential for recreation and creation of green jobs. And finally, there's a work package on communication and awareness raising. That's the overview of the project. Now, let's dive into this topic of definition of primary and old growth forests. So EU biodiversity strategy and also the forest strategy have stated that all remaining primary and old growth forests in Europe should be defined, mapped, monitored, and strictly protected, which is, of course, a very important goal, as still at this date, primary and old growth forests are being threatened by all kinds of interventions, infrastructure, harvesting, etc. So in the one of the basic ideas, or one of the first tasks that we tried to cover, was to develop a literature overview on old growth related to beech forest, trying to find out what are the definitions and what are criterion indicators that are commonly used or have been used in the past related to old growth, but also to beech forest more specifically. The report can be downloaded from our Life Prognoses website. And this document was also an important source of inspiration or input to the very important Commission guidelines for defining, mapping, monitoring, and strictly protecting the EU primary and old growth forests, which was finalized in 2023, and which is now the basic document for member states to organize the mapping and protection of old growth forests and primary forests in their country. So what is primary and what is old growth? That was, of course, that's the first thing. There's a lot of different definitions going around, especially for old growth forest, but also for primary forest. There's also other terms that are used: primeval, virgin forest, etc. EU decided to have these two terms, primary and old growth, and for primary forest, they decided to copy the definition that was already used by FAO, which states that we're looking at naturally regenerated forests of native tree species where there are no clearly visible indications of human activities. So there's no traces of tree stumps after harvesting. There's no roots. There's no clearly visible indications, and the ecological processes are not significantly disturbed by man. So all the different developmental stages of the forest are present. Going from the early innovation aggregation state until the late biostatic and aggregation phases. Important to know is that if these older stands are disturbed by stand replacing natural disturbances like fire or bark beetle outbreaks, you will get into a phase where you get a younger forest, but also that younger forest is considered to be part of the natural cycle and considered as primary forest, although it looks much younger than what we normally associate with the primary forest. So very important to know that also these are included in the primary forest. For old growth forest, there's been definitions already going back to the 1980s, developed for the Pacific Northwest in the US. Different interpretations, different definitions have been developed. So EU has decided to describe in their own way what they consider old growth forest. So it's a forest stand or an area consisting of native tree species where structures and dynamics that we normally associate with the late serial developmental phases of a forest are present. So that's the part here in green. So there's over mature trees, there's large amounts of deadwood, etc. Um, Signs of former human activities may be visible, but they are gradually disappearing due to being the forest set aside. So this is the normal situation on the right-hand side in a managed forest where we would kind of shortcut the natural cycle of a forest, removing the forest or removing the trees once they reach harvestable maturity, and the right the half of the natural cycle is missing. And what is happening in these old growth forests is that by setting them aside over time, they gradually redevelop these later stages. Also important is that in the explanatory notes of EU, it clearly states that once you have delineated the area and it gets hit by a natural disaster or whatever, it still continues to have this strictly protected status. So it is not that if you delineate some old growth areas and at a certain point there's a bark beetle outbreak that they lose their status. So the strict protection is normally forever. Also very important to know. But of course, as you can see, these are very descriptive definitions, and if you want to come from descriptive definitions to a practical tool to delineate these areas in your country, you need some criteria and indicators. And also very important to know is that old growth is not like a binary status on or off. It's a very gradual process, and depending sorry, depending on the local conditions or decisions, it is unclear where you should put the threshold to consider something as being an old growth forest or not. So one would put the line here, others would put them on a different location. So it is important to have some measurable ways to define and to decide on what you will include and what you will not include in old growth mapping. Also, you pointed out some possible or important indicators. So you have to look at the species composition. There should be certain amounts of deadwood present, and also presence of large or old overmature trees. Other possible indicators are the stand origin, where it clearly says that mostly they will be from natural regeneration, but they can also be planted. These formerly planted forests that are developing in old age are not excluded. There's a certain structural complexity, both in the horizontal and the vertical dimension. There's some soil microrelief due to windrow of trees, and there's trees present containing tree-related microhabitats, just like cavities, mushrooms, etc. And in some countries, also indicator species are used to define the areas with the highest potential or the highest continuity of old growth characteristics. This is specifically very important in boreal forest where trees don't reach very large sizes. As I already pointed out, there's a very wide variety of how an old growth forest can look like, and also the dimensions they can reach. So depending on the forest type you're looking at, different aspects will be predominant. It is obvious that in these boreal forests, there will be no very large trees, but even within the beech forest, there will be quite some variability. And that is what we try to cover with our research in Life Prognosis. So in Life Prognosis, we did some fieldwork covering over 2,000 sample plots in 12 different sites, going from managed beech forest up to primary beech dominated forest stands. And based on that, we could get some figures, some overview figures of what values for the different indicators can be found in these different situations. So to give a first example on living biomass, you can see the results for managed up to primary forests. What is the total biomass that is present, expressed in cubic meters per hectare here? And the first example is quite obvious. This is from Central Balkan National Park. These are the managed areas on the left. From around the national park, and then you see gradually more volume of biomass when you get into longer set-aside areas, with the primary forest having the highest biomass. If we then focus on the primary forests only, considering them as a reference sites, then we can also see that there is an overall average of 675 cubic meters per hectare. But that average figure is instructive and important. But even more important is that we can see that depending on the local conditions, the local growth conditions, these figures can be very varying, going from 500 cubic meters up to 1,000 cubic meters. So depending on the local site conditions, natural variability will be different depending on the site where you look at. We will now look at a number of other indicators, like for instance the dead wood volume. Also here you see this gradual buildup of the volume of dead wood the longer the site has been set aside. If we look at the primary reference sites, again, we see quite some variability, an overall average figure of about 90 cubic meters, but you can see that in certain sites, the deadwood volume is only around 20, and in others, it can go up to 150 cubic meters. Density of very large trees. So one of the elements that is very typical for old growth forests is that there are trees present that are over their natural or the over the age that they are normally harvested. So older trees. In that context, it's important to know that here we use this 80 centimeter diameter threshold. Of course, in some sites, trees don't reach that size. So there you will have to adjust your threshold diameter to decide whether over mature trees are present. So size and age of trees is not always coinciding. But again, here you can see that in all of these primary forests, there is a certain number of very large trees present that can go up to 30 trees per hectare in Cinca forest, for example. But in other sites with less fertile soils, for instance, these numbers can be much lower. Same for the share of very large trees in the biomass. That's another indicator that is often used to find or to describe old growth forest. An important part of the total biomass is concentrated in these very large trees. Overall, that can be around 25%, but ranging from 5 to 50%. And then on structural diversity, not only very large trees are present, but also in the mid-sized trees, there's a very wide variety of tree sizes. On average, around 35 centimeter diameter, this difference in the interquartile range. In a plantation or an even age forest, this will be close to zero. So you can clearly see that even in the mid-age trees, there's quite a wide variability and wide variety of sizes. And then finally, on these microhabitats, this is just an example on trees with cavities. We see that quite a number of trees show cavities, over 20 trees per hectare on average. Also, again, here with a wide variability between sites. but trees with cavities, be it rot holes or woodpecker cavities, are omnipresent in these old growth forests. To come to my conclusions, so primary and old growth forests are descriptive concepts that reflect rare and threatened qualities in European forests. The level of old growthness is a gradual characteristic and strongly dependent on the local growth conditions that cannot be fixed in single threshold values. So reference value ranges from primary forest can help us to substantiate national mapping procedures. In the coming weeks, we will summarize these reference values and value ranges in relation to the site conditions, calculate some composite old growth indicator values, which will be covered by Peter in a moment, and compile the result in a scientific paper. And that's it for me. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we will deal with them after the presentations.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now we can move on to our next speaker.
Yes, thanks, Sandra. A very warm welcome also from my side. Let me say that I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share some ideas and concepts of how to possibly quantify old growthness on the basis of field data. So I will just share my screen. Let's dive into, after Chris has presented some very interesting results on structural characteristics of old growth, how we can possibly assess the level of old growthness based on field data. And I would like to recall first, and show my outline. So I would like to recall the old growth characteristics. Then I would like to present an approach to quantify old growthness, the so-called OGI indicator, and the way in Life Prognosis how we have tried to adjust this initial original approach to the available data, World Heritage data set, as was also already presented by Chris. You saw the different sites all over Europe where we could conduct field sampling and use the data. And then I would like briefly to present the main results of this adapted OGI and give an outlook concerning a possible way how to design a rapid field assessment, because I think the main challenge is that we have to cover large areas once we really would like to assess the level of old growthness and then draw some conclusions. So just to recall old growth characteristics, Chris has already explained that it's a continuous feature. It's not categorical, not only black or white or yes or no, and that old growthness is characterized by a very complex multivariate structure, and that's a dynamic concept. And just to show the uniqueness of old growthness, I would like to present one result from another project that we could carry out in Germany, where we compared on the one hand the structural features of true primary forests in eastern Slovakia to managed and set-aside forests in Germany, and just to show the syndrome of shifting baseline on example of the deadwood volume. You see how large the difference is even between set-aside forests, which are set aside for 20 to 30 years, to primary forests and to other managed forests. It should just underline the uniqueness of old growthness and also the possibly long way to high level old growthness. But now let's step into this original old growth indicator, which was the approach was published in Ecological Indicators in 2021. And the approach is the following. We used 3 primary beech forests as reference for maximum old growthness. And it's important to stress that it's a stand-related approach. That means old growthness is characterized on the basis of delineated stands in the field. And we could draw on 9 dendrometric sample plots per stand in this initial approach. Then we tested in a very complex procedure different variables and ended up with 27 variables, which are arranged to 9 criteria. These are the criteria: deadwood, decay stages, development stages, microhabitats, and so on. So we tried to really develop an approach that is suitable to cover the complexity of structural characteristics of old-growthness, and then to pay attention or to really have an approach that takes consideration of the variation. We used a bootstrapping procedure to derive 90% ranges of variation per variable, and this OGI is constructed to give single as well as aggregated values. So you can have a single value of an overall old-growthness, but you can also dive into the single variables to see what are the specific characteristics for a specific site, which make it or which add up to a certain degree of old-growthness. And this is the approach. We compare a 90% range of old-growthness derived from old-growth stands and compare it to the 90% range of the comparison stands. And we distinguish between an overlap between these ranges, but we also pay attention to the excess structural features. Just think of, for example, introduced species, not native species. They add up to, or they give a certain characteristic of the comparison stand that is not comparable to old-growthness. And then both of these indices are combined to a final OGI. Applying this initial or original approach to the available World Heritage data set was a great opportunity because we could extend the reference frame considerably. So the natural range of variation for beech forest was much better covered, but there were also certain challenges which were arising from the use of already available dendrometric data. So not all variables could be reproduced, which are implemented in the original approach. And one major challenge was that the plot number was not always sufficient to conduct bootstrapping per stand. And we tried to solve these problems by 2 ways. On the one hand, we reduced the set of variables. Still covered are the attributes very large trees, deadwood, structural diversity, tree species composition, and tree microstructures. But we were not able to implement characteristics of tree regeneration. And to solve the problem of not sufficient plots per stand, we have built spatially explicit clusters of plots based on the time since abandonment, that is TSA, forest type, and age structure. And just to give an idea how this looks like, in here you see the plot distribution within the World Heritage Site Kellerwald in Germany, and the plots with different colors are denoting these clusters of spatially explicit groups of sample plots. And so the OGI values were then calculated for these clusters. This is the main result for this OGI adjusted. And here you see the box plots for the managed stands, the set-aside stands, and the primary stands. And with different letters is denoted whether we see a significant difference between the different groups. And you can see that there is a significant difference between the managed stands and the primary stands, and the set-aside stands are just in between. On the first glance, it might be a bit surprising to see a rather low difference between these three groups, but I think this is due to the fact that we have a considerably high level of naturalists already in the managed stands, meaning the tree species composition is very natural. They are dominated by beech trees, and also they have been managed in a near natural way. So once we would compare the primary stands to, let's say, spruce plantations, for example, this would end up with much lower OGI values then. And nevertheless, I would like to stress it's a long way to high-level old-growthness. This is indicated by the still significant difference between the set-aside stands, which are on average set aside for 6 decades already, and the primary stands. So the last thing I would like to, or the last topic I would like to address, whether we can find a way how to map larger areas, because one thing that we have to stress is that this OGI, even the adjusted approach, needs more or less intensive field sampling based on sample plots. And this is certainly not the way how we can really assess and map old-growthness on large areas. The OGI approach, I think, would be suitable as sort of a reference for a maybe rapid assessment, even as you will see in the talk by Manuela Hirschmogel after my talk, for remote sensing maybe, but it's not suitable to map large areas because it takes too much resources concerning money and stuff. Conclusions for a rapid field assessment. What we did is that we tried to figure out how large the contribution of these 12 single variables is to the overall variation of the OGI. And this is the main result. You see on the y-axis the cumulative R square. Then you see which variable contributes which share to the cumulated R square. And if we target at covering 95% of the variation of the overall OGI adjusted, then we would be able to cover this with only 3 variables, which is very good news, I would say. The number of giant trees, the total deadwood volume, and the number of development phases. So this might open up a perspective, prospects for a rapid field assessment. Maybe it is, or just a good way might be a sort of a transect sampling, which can rapidly be carried out, where we combine a line intersect sampling, for example, for deadwood, and a distance sampling maybe for the giant trees. This could be suitable to map old-growthness of larger areas of mature forest with native tree species composition. So this features native tree species composition and maturity could be assessed maybe on the basis of remote sensing already to map the stands which qualify for old-growthness in a general sense. So then let me conclude. I think we were able within Life Prognosis to extend the database of reference stands considerably. And I think it's good news that the available data are suitable to calculate an adjusted OGI. The rather high level of outgrowthness we see also in the managed stands may be attributed to a close to nature tree species composition and close to nature management. And I would like to stress, nevertheless, it's a long way to high level outgrowthness, and prospects for mapping on large areas is on the one hand to employ remote sensing approaches, and a rapid field assessment might be possible on the basis of transect sampling. So with this slide, I would like to end. Thank you a lot for your attention, and I'm happy to receive some questions which will be discussed then later on. Thanks a lot, and I would like to hand over to Manuela Hirschmugel. Okay. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for laying out so nicely to introduce my work. Do you see my screen in full? Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, welcome also from my side. Glad to be here today. Thanks for having the opportunity. My name is Manuela Hirschmugel. I'm from the University of Graz and from Joanneum Research. And I want to talk a little bit on how we can use remote sensing for this issue of old growth mapping. Couple of words on the content. So we already heard on Peter's talk on why remote sensing is needed. I will just recap a bit on that, and then going back also to the talk of Chris, which parameters would we need to map? Then I will have a look at the test sites and data we used, a workflow, some results and discussions. So why is mapping difficult? Peter already said that, and Chris as well. There is no black and white. There is not one indicator. So age itself is not enough. So there is some reasons why this mapping possibility is not easy. The other is that old growth forests and primary forests are usually in Europe relatively small, relatively scattered, and often located in mountainous areas. This is for good reason, because the forests that are easily accessible have been exploited in the past, but those forests which are in a very remote areas, in the high mountains, in steep terrain, there, of course, these forests were kept untouched for a long time. Sabatini et al., they did an analysis, and they estimated that only 1% of Europe's forest is still considered primary. If we go to old growth, it's a few more percent, but still it's not like vast amounts, like when you're looking into Canada or something like that. And why do we need to know that? Also, that was already laid out by Chris, that we have this legislation now that we should protect all primary and old growth forest by the EU. And so, of course, if we want to protect something, we need to know where it is. And this wall-to-wall information can not only help to identify areas, but also to see the complete picture, so that you know where can we put stepping stones, where can we interlink protected areas, things like that, guiding restoration measures. So all of this, I think remote sensing can definitely have a helping hand, let's say. Okay, so also this was already mentioned by Chris and by Peter. So it's not only one thing. So there is large and old trees, there is deadwood, structural complexity, tree species, and the existence of specific biota. Basically, with remote sensing, we can do something on the first four, I'd say, but I will focus on age, so large and old trees / age, and on structural complexity in my talk today. When we have these parameters we discussed a little bit. Now the question is, which remote sensing data can be used to address these parameters? There is a paper, if you're more interested, there is a paper out in Environmental Modeling and Assessment where we reviewed more in detail. So I can just give you a very quick overview. And I selected like 4 groups of remote sensing data that are typically used for individual parameters. There is the optical high-resolution satellite data, which you probably know, like it's the Sentinel-2 typical, or the Landsat series, where we can classify age classes, where we can nicely classify disturbances. So to a certain extent, also standing deadwood. Obviously, due to the resolution, we cannot see individual trees, but like clusters of dead trees affected by bug beetle and things like that are can well be picked up by this time series of Sentinel-2 data, for example. And also tree species or tree species groups. There are several mapping exercises out there, even national ones for Germany, for example, for Austria. So this is something that can be done based on optical high-resolution data. Optical very high-resolution data, you probably all of you know, orthophotos, aerial images that have been used for many decades now in the planning of protected area management. Of course, we can see tree species, we can see standing deadwood on the individual tree level, and also some structural parameters. But here the automation is not at the same level, but with deep learning, we see more and more parameters that can be also automatized from this optical very high resolution data. Then there is SAR data, radar data. We can see some things on biomass. There is now a new biomass sensor, a satellite sensor on a B-band, so we can see biomass, something on biomass and structural complexity, but more on a large area. So you would not see like very small patches of differences, at least with most of the SAR data that are available. There is also a difference on scaling in different SAR datasets. Last but not least, airborne laser scanning or LiDAR data. This is something that is very well used and well suited, especially as we have seen in Peter's presentation before, the existence of giant trees. So the tree height is one very important parameter in order to identify agroforests. And this is why airborne laser scanning is able to penetrate the ground. So you get the return from the ground, you get the return from the canopy, and you can deduct the tree height very, very accurately. I would even say more accurately than from the field. In some cases, I did my PhD on that. And structural complexity is another issue. So if you can see from this airborne laser scanning image that you can see how many trees are in which layer, you can assess how many returns you get in the individual height levels. So you can assess some of this. Biomass, obviously, if you know the height of the trees, you can also calculate biomass, and to some extent, but this is still a bit in the early phase, we can also see something online there. Let me now go to test sites and data. So we did not map all of the areas that we have seen in the presentations before. We focused on 4 areas that cover like the biogeographical regions quite nicely. So the Sonian Forest, the Kalkalp National Park, the Central Parker National Park, and the Abruzzo National Park. And you can see the protected areas here are displayed in red lines. Which data did we have? We had data obviously for all of them through the Copernicus. So the Sentinel-2 data, it's an open and free data set from the European Space Agency through the Copernicus program. So we had optical high resolution satellite data for all of those. And for the 2 Sonian Forest and Kalkalp National Park, we had additional airborne laser scanning data. Let me stick a bit to the airborne LiDAR data. When we talk about structures, I already mentioned that LiDAR data is able to penetrate the ground, so we get not only information on the total height, but also on intermediate information. So this is an example. These blue bars that you can see here are the returns in the individual height slices. So if you could say these 1 meter slices, and you can see how much of the signal is reflected from the individual height layers. And from that, you can deduct, okay, here apparently most of it is returned from one small part in the top canopy. So this is like one layer and we have a low vertical structure. The second example, which you can see here, the image for it is very different. Obviously, you can see that these returns are the reflections are returned from very different layers within the height spectrum, so that we have something from the ground, we have something in these intermediate heights, and then also in the top heights. So we can deduct from that that these forests are of higher vertical structure. We also investigated that in a paper where we also had some reference data, and we could nicely see that this foliage height diversity index, it's an indicator calculated based on these layers. We don't need to go into detail. If you're interested, you can look up this paper. But we can see that the low structure, we are somewhere here, and the higher structure, we get also this FHD value in the higher. So what we can see is this FHD seems to be a good measure that we can use in order to assess the structural diversity. So this is what we also included in our test sites where we had ALS data. Now this is a bit of a messy, overcrowded slide, sorry for that, but if someone of you wants to dive a bit deeper into remote sensing, I just thought I would put all the parameters that there are. I will just walk you through very quickly. So we had the Sentinel-2 time series that I said before from the Copernicus. We had the individual spectral bands. We calculated some indices, some vegetation indices, for example, and we calculated also texture features. So why is that? You can imagine if you have old large crowns and then some trees fall over in an older forest, that creates gaps. So you have some kind of higher structure, different patterns in the reflectance, also in the satellite imagery. And this is what we try to capture by these textural features. And then we have the ALS data, as I said, only for 2 sites. There we calculated typical parameters like maximum vegetation height, mean vegetation height, standard deviation. Standard deviation is also important. We have a very high tree, low tree. So this is obviously also something that we expect to see more in open forest than in managed forest. And then there's also the terrain elevation as a separate parameter. So all of these, they add up to 160 input features that we used, and this is now the overall workflow. So we used the Sentinel data and all these features, the ALS data with these features, and you see an example here how this looks like. And then we had some reference data, and the issue is that we needed some reference data from the sites, and although we collected 2,000 field plots, this is not enough to train a machine learning program properly and subdivide this training data from a test data. So that's why we relied on some separate reference data to train the algorithm and then compare that to the field assessments. So what did we do? We calculated 2 different features. One is the age classes, and the other one is an old growth map. And here is a first or the result for Sonian forest. And here we had, as I said before, not only the Sentinel data, but also the ALS data. And you can see here the age, the estimated age based on the remote sensing data, from light colors, young forest, to dark green in the older forest. And we can see that there is quite a difference. The main patterns might be similar, but there are also some significant difference where we can see that the LiDAR data, the height data that we get, improves our classification, and also we can see that the mean error is lower in this when we include LiDAR data. Okay, this is a second example. This is the Central Balkan National Park, and what I want to show with this is here you can see in this small exact map the protected areas, these red lines. So you can see that they are divided in this area, and we have now calculated like wall to wall the age classes. And in green is the oldest one, dark green is the oldest one. So that fits relatively well. And what we can now do is to say, okay, we can target the areas that are also similarly old, and we can say, okay, these are the potential those forests that should be protected in the next step, or should be used for stepping stones, or where we do some field work, as pointed out by Peter before. So this is something where I really think that remote sensing can give really an added value to the practical implementation as well. Of course, I have to say that we still have a mean era of 40 years. So we don't know exactly how old the forests are, but we know, okay, this is like relatively old, very old. In this range, they are medium and they are very young. And I think that's already helpful in order to target the field measurements. We did also one assessment for the Kalkart National Park where we had information to train for oak growthiness. So we had 3 classes managed close to nature as an intermediate class and oak growth. And as you can see here, this is error matrix. So this is the reference. So from the reference, 110 managed areas, 107 were also classified as managed. So that worked very well. The old growth also worked so. And of course, the close to nature, as has been shown before by Peter, is always an intermediate class. So we have some overlaps here. But again, this can be used to rule out some areas that we don't have to look at or focus our areas. What is a bit surprising to me that the ALS did not improve the results so much, and we dived a bit deeper into it, and this was also mentioned by Chris. When you have some natural disturbances, then, for example, if an avalanche goes down, all the big trees are removed, but they are still considered oak growth forests. But the LiDAR picks up the tree height, and if there is basically no tree height, of course, the prediction does not work as good. So we have to be aware of these physical parameters that are in the back. So let me come to a conclusion. What we have seen is a slightly better performance with airborne laser scanning for age classification compared to only Sentinel, but it was actually not that significant as we expected. We also did some analysis to validate our results with the reference, with the field data, but it's always a bit critical because the field plots are very small and comparing them with a larger area. So this is still work ongoing. But what we can say already is that the remote sensing based mapping can serve as a hotspot mapping for larger areas to point out potential for targeted field assessments, etc. A bit of an outlook. Of course, there's always more to work on. So even if the project ends, the work never ends. So we still have to do some detailed analysis, and we will also publish that in a paper. Also, what I think is very important is to expand that to other forest types, not only beech, because that changes many things. And what we're now also doing, which is kind of a follow-up of this Life Prognosis, is we cooperate with colleagues from Slovenia who have nationwide ALS data, and we do some assessments also to see what is the gap structure that we can see very nicely with the ALS data, differences in height patterns, as you can see here, some very first results, and yeah, there's more to go on. And with that, I think I'm at the end. I hope I didn't take too much time. I usually talk too much. So thank you very much for your patience and for listening and for your interest. And thanks also to all the partners who provided input to this. Otherwise, it would not have been possible. Okay, and with that, I will give the word to Klaus.
My name is Klaus Steinbauer, and I will talk today about the biodiversity in European beech forests, which was also one part of the Prognosis Life project. And I did my analysis together with Hans Kirchmeier mainly. And when we are talking about biodiversity, one second. So beech forests are recognized as hotspots for European biodiversity for certain taxa. So this is an important component to consider. And when you think of the species, of course, woodpeckers certainly will come up to your mind, but there are also less visible species, many different arthropods depending on forest structures. Epiphytic species like this ferns you can see in this image, also a very large amount of fungi is dependent on different forest structures, especially on deadwood. And this has been recognized also in the past. The fungi communities in forests, these vast networks are also recognized as wood wide webs. So really important species group. And in the Prognosis project, the only direct diversity measure we had were the species richness, the tree species richness, and nothing. And therefore, it was really interesting for us to find approaches to get proxies for biodiversity measurements. And this also resulted in my two questions that I wanted to explore with this talk. So the first question, can forest structure help explain biodiversity in beech forests? And how does the human impact influence biodiversity in beech forests? So if you think of a managed forest, you have different decay stages. This is just should just bring up to your mind that in the different successional stages of a forest, you have different structures, different habitats for species, and this is an important component for forest biodiversity. And so at first this brings me to the next point, how forest structures influence the biodiversity. So we did a literature review on this topic and found, I will just show you some examples, but for the structural components in a beech forest, we found many publications that give that show that there is a strong relationship between the structures and biodiversity. So this is from Brunet et al. And shows a table with different forest structures on the left side, also different forest management types. And on the far right, there's also the biodiversity. And these green rectangles show structural parameters that have also been assessed by the Prognosis Consortium. And it shows you that the biodiversity shows more or less strong relationship with many of these structural parameters, with the canopy layering, with very large trees, with deadwood, and with the tree-related microhabitats. When we look at the species levels, also from the same study, so also different taxa are highly dependent on the management. So that the diversity is dependent on forest management for herbaceous plants, for ground arthropods, land snails, saproxylic fungi and beetles, nesting birds like the woodpeckers, and also many epiphytic species like this epiphytic biophytes or lichens. One structural component that has been considered for quite a long time now to be of importance for biodiversity is the amount of deadwood. So why is it so important? On the one hand, because it just offers a new resource and an increased resource availability, and with more surface offers more opportunities for different species to live next to each other. It increases also the habitat diversity. And as you can see on this slide on the right side, there's also a strong correlation between the amount of deadwood and the number of critically endangered species in forest ecosystems. So a very important component to consider. We've also heard of these very large trees. Partly this is also already connected to the amount on the surface area. So when you have a large tree, you have more surface that can be settled by different species. It offers also unique microhabitats like cavities, large branches, deep bark crevices, and it supports saproxylic species as well. And of course, it increases the structural complexity in a forest stand. So this is the reason why very large trees are important for biodiversity, and this is also directly connected with this tree-related microhabitats, because the longer individual tree is in an ecosystem, the higher is the probability that certain tree-related microhabitats are present in such a tree. These tree-related microhabitats have become quite important in the past decade in forest ecosystems, because it was found that some species, for example, certain fly species, are dependent on cracks and holes where rainwater is collected for reproduction. It offers really special structures, and some species are really specialized on these structures that are common in natural forests. And if you think of these different tree-related microhabitats, what is meant by it? So it's epiphytic and epicyclic structures, cavities, exudates, fruiting bodies of fungi, also grown deadwood, so deadwood structures on a living tree, and also injuries on a tree. With our literature review, we also found that not all tree-related microhabitats are good proxies for the naturalness of, or are good proxies for biodiversity and the naturalness of a forest stand. And here you can see the study from Büttler et al. And on the lower left, you see this bar with the beetle and with the eggs. And the beetle is is an estimation how common this tree-related microhabitat is in a natural forest stand, and that the eggs is standing for the managed forest stand. And this trunk base rot hole, for example, is common in natural forests, but less common in managed forests. So it can be considered a good proxy for naturalness of a forest stand. To analyze the data, I had to split it up into 3 regions. So I analyzed the lowland, the northern lowland forests, beech forests, and called it just the N group. The M group are the Alpine and Carpathian forest stands, and the South European stands is the third group that I investigated separately. The reason for this is that we've heard already of these different indicators, and on the plot level, there were 2 indicators assessed. One was the time since abandonment of forest management and the silvicultural treatment type. And for some regions, there were not many different levels for each category available. And this is the reason why I grouped the data together. We also tried to assess, to use this set aside and this management category, to group it together in a matrix to assess the amount of human impact on the plot level. And this is our result from this. And we use this human impact indicator, as we called it, to to see whether we find a pattern in forest structural parameters. This I will show you in my next slides now. So this is, as mentioned, the only direct diversity measure we have in the prognosis dataset, the tree richness. It showed, so on the x-axis, you have the human impact indicator, and on the y-axis, the richness. And it showed for all three regions, we found a significant decrease with increase in human impact for this tree richness. And interestingly, in the northern regions, on the lowland beech forests, the overall richness was highest. For the presence of the very large trees, we found a similar pattern, which was most pronounced in the northern forest stands. So also again a decreasing probability of occurrence for these very large trees. It was also significant for this middle and southern regions, but most pronounced in the northern regions. For the deadwood, the pattern is again the same. Just to confuse you a little, we have here the colors are not the regions. The colors in this graph are the different decay stages of the deadwood, and the different regions are are these three plots. So on the left side you have the southern plots, middle northern, and on the right side the Alpine and Carpathian plots. And for all three regions, you see that the amount of deadwood is decreasing with the human impact indicator. So a clear result that human impact in the prognosis data set has an effect on the amount of deadwood. And for the tree-related microhabitats, I have to say that overall 15 different tree-related microhabitats have been assessed. For this analysis, I only used 5, which were the base rot hole, the trunk rot hole, bark pocket, the cracks, and polypores, because this one are considered strong indicators for natural forests. And for these 5 different tree-related microhabitats, we find a significant probability, or we find a significant trend that its probability of occurrence is decreasing with the amount of human impact. So in line with other literature on this topic. So now we have all these different structural parameters and see that there's a clear pattern with the human impact indicator. And as a next step, we also wanted to assess the biodiversity on the plot level based on the structural parameters. And for this, we used a tool that was developed already more than 10 years ago by Loriot and Gonin. It's the index of biodiversity potential. And the basic idea is to give the practitioners a tool that allows them to quantify the biodiversity based on structural forest stands. It's composed, the original indicator is composed of 10 parameters, which are grouped in 4 key ecological dimensions, which are the tree-related microhabitats, deadwood, tree species diversity, and stand structural features. In our case, we had to adapt this index of biodiversity potential a little. It was also reused recently by Zeller et al. So deviating from the original scores, we used the scoring from 0 to 5, where 0 indicates a low biodiversity potential and 5 a high biodiversity potential. And we used the following structural parameters: the tree richness, the number of vegetation layers, the amount of deadwood, and this separated in deadwood standing and deadwood lying. we used the very large trees and the number of tree-related microhabitats. And we grouped or summed for each plot, we summed these parameters together. And I will just show you now the final result at the moment. You see a lot of points. So the y-axis gives the index of biodiversity potential. X-axis is the human impact indicator. I left the points, which are the raw data per plot, just to give you an idea of how diverse each plot can be. But overall, we find an increasing trend with increasing human impact in all three regions. The lowest biodiversity potential was observed in this Alpine and Carpathian region, but the difference is marginal. So I think it's a real effect. And this is almost my final slide. Let's just come to my conclusions. And with my conclusions, I want to again refer to the questions I stated at the beginning. So can forest structure help explain biodiversity in beech forests? So based on our literature review, we can clearly say yes. So structural indicators are partly good indicators for biodiversity. And in our case, they show also directional trends with the human impact indicator in all regions, but with different magnitude. This relates already a bit to my second question I asked. So how does the human impact influence biodiversity in beech forests? And as I've shown you with my last graph, so the index of biodiversity potential shows a directional relationship with the human impact indicator, and more human impact results in less biodiversity potential. Yeah, and that's the end already of my presentation. Thanks for your attention, and I will pass the word to Caroline.
Thank you, Klaus. So we'll have 15 minutes for the questions, but we were a bit afraid that some people might already forgot the conclusions of the first presentation, so we put them on slides. So Klaus, can you go to the next slide, please? So the conclusions of the presentation of Chris were that primary and old-growth forests are descriptive concepts that reflect rare and threatened qualities in European forests. Level of old-growthness is a gradual characteristic and strongly depends on local growth conditions that cannot be fixed in single threshold values. And reference value ranges from primary forest may help to substantiate national mapping procedures. Then we had the presentation of Peter. So he was very happy that the adjustment of the old growth indicator to the available World Heritage data was successful. And then, of course, for mapping of old growth forests for large forest areas, a rapid field assessment could be developed based on the results of Life Prognoses. Then we went to the presentation of Manuela, and she stated that at this moment there is currently no remote sensing method that can alone classify the complex and multifaceted nature of old-growth forest with high accuracy at reasonable costs. But however, remote sensing is useful to map forest age classes, species, distribution, forest structure, and other indicators to pinpoint areas of potential old-growth forests for targeted and therefore cost-efficient field inspections. And then to end with Klaus, so structural indicators are closely linked with biodiversity. And of course, more human impact means less biodiversity potential. So that's just a wrap up of the conclusions of all presentations. So a big thank you, before we go to the Q&A, a big thank you to all the presenters of this morning. A big thank you to EUROPARC for hosting us. We never had so many people attending our conferences. So and they're very professional people. So it's a pleasure to work with them. Also, big thank you to Ruth, my colleague, who did all the preparation of this workshop. There's more research going on. We had to cut, with the number of presentations because of the duration of this webinar. So there will be more papers on our website soon. So there's still 1 month in the project. So for more outputs, please check our website. And now over to Q&A. I think Jessica, you monitored the chat. So over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. Very kind of you, and the pleasure is all ours. That is correct. Jess collected the questions, and I will go in order. The first one was still during presentation from Chris, and it's from Jutta. She's saying, why is the living biomass in the Kalkalpen less in long untouched areas compared to managed sites?
Hi, Chris again. That was very sharply spotted by the question asker. Indeed, in some situations, the biomass can be higher in the managed areas compared to the set aside areas in specific conditions. And often this is the case when the primary forest or the long set aside forest are in remote areas on steep slopes with much less productive site conditions than the managed forest. Of course, the managed forest is mostly located in areas which are easily reachable, but also in the most productive areas. So this can also blur our conclusions, and it's something that we always have to take into consideration when we make a comparison to check whether the site conditions are comparable. And in these specific cases, that can be different. On the contrary, in other sites like Central Balkan, we clearly saw a clear increase in biomass depending on the site on the time since abandonment. So that's a peculiarity that is related to the site conditions.
Thank you, Chris. The next question came during Manuela's presentation from Zoltan, who asks, have you actually utilized the updated dataset of Sabatini et al.? He also sent a link.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zoltan. We have not included it at this point because it's more on a primary forest, and we wanted to spot like old growth forests. But it is definitely an important contribution. And once we go into this like wall-to-wall European assessments, it's definitely a very good basis. And I'm happy to see you next week at the kickoff meeting where we will work together, and then this will definitely be also a way to go forward. Yeah.
Very nice. Thank you, Manuela. The next question comes from Christian, and it's to all speakers. So the one who knows first can volunteer. What measures do you recommend to decision makers in terms of mitigating the effects of climate change based on your findings so far?
Maybe I can kick off. It's quite a difficult one. I think what is important in relation to climate change in relation to primary and old growth forest is this concept of connectivity. I think it will be important that we not only protect these old growth patches, especially when they are small and isolated. It will be important to interconnect them as good as possible with managed forests, but also with smaller set-aside patches to make sure that if certain areas degrade, there is a possibility for species to migrate. But I'm quite confident that the more natural forests are also more resistant to important impacts of climate change. Of course, windstorm will be more frequent, so old growth forest and primary forest may also look a bit different in the future, but I think they can persist.
Thank you. And I see Peter has his hand up, but before we jump to that, there was one question before the one addressed to him. It comes from Anne to all speakers, and she's asking what recommendation based on your work would you give to policymakers? Peter, again. Please.
Yeah, just to add and also maybe include or add a little bit on that what Chris has already said. I mean,
Sure.
what we could show one more time is that the old growth forests are unique and that they are very important also for climate mitigation in that sense that they store a lot of carbon. And I think there are good indications that they are capable of reacting more or less resilient also to disturbances in a way. We saw these pictures of regeneration, for example, in Chris' presentation. So I think one thing that is for sure is that we really should speed up in mapping these old growth forests, and that we should endeavor to find a good way to finalize this mapping to really protect these old growth forests, which besides are also important for learning about the natural capacity of our forests to react to disturbances, climate-driven disturbances. So that's, in my eyes, the main, let's say, recommendation to policymakers from our project. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I will continue right with the next question, again addressed to you. It comes from Sigmund. He says, we must convince politics that something is really old growth and must be protected. On the other side, we need to be fast in identifying old growth. What is your take on this tense relationship and looking from your perspective of rapid field assessment? And how many indicators should we pick, or how few?
Okay, thanks a lot for this very interesting question. Not so easy to answer, but what we saw is, I mean, on the one hand, old growth is very complex, but on the other hand, we saw that especially the features of giant trees and of high amount of deadwood, both attributes which develop over long periods of time, are very good indicators for old growthness, I would say. So we could just dive into an even more concrete, let's say, condensation of indicators based on these two attributes, I could imagine. But maybe my colleagues would also like to add on this a little bit. And I mean, what I would need to stress is that it really needs another in-depth discussion to really end up with a very reliable rapid assessment approach, but I see prospects for that.
Thank you very much. I'm now giving the last chance to anyone who might be interested to ask any other questions. And in the meantime, I will take your attentions for a second on our survey that we usually like to circulate at the end of our webinars, because we really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts. It is important for us to continue creating these events and to always seek for ways to improve. So please head on to the link that will also be shared in the chat. There you will have a short survey which will scan your satisfaction with today's webinar. We appreciate your feedback and thank you very much for taking the time to answer those questions. I'm checking now if there are any new questions. It doesn't seem so far. So I will take a chance to thank all the amazing speakers and presenters from today. Thank you for sharing these insights with all of our participants. As mentioned, this recording, as well as the presentation, will be available on our website following this webinar. So thank you everyone for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in some of our future events or webinars. Please stay tuned and follow our website as well as social media profiles to stay updated on everything that is happening. Thank you very much once again. Have a lovely rest of the day and see you in next events. Bye bye.